Welcome home to Passionate Justice. Passionate Justice 166 for the week of 25 February 2017. I am Jonathan Wolfman. Thank you so much for being with us this week on Our Salon Radio. At Our Salon Radio, we invite you to read with us, write with us, and of course, while you're not required to write, if you're comfier reading and commenting, I do think eventually you will want to write. You may join the Our Salon readers and writers community of over 1,100 superb writers and keen readers, personal essay, memoir, poetry, political and social justice commentary, where www.oursalon.ning.com. Join us. Membership, as with all the best of life, is free. And now, Passionate Justice may be heard not only on Our Salon Radio, but Monday nights, 7 p.m. Pacific, on APRI, Alternative Public Radio International. You may listen to all of Our Salon's programs. Listen at your leisure by going to www.oursalon.ning.com/new episodes. One word, new episodes. Now, I want you to remember as you wake up each morning to say this: aloud is best. God bless our newborn Reich. See, I become concerned when progressives analyze fascists' moves to a point of harm, where what matters are their takes on each separate, deliberately steamrolled insult to democracy, so that by the time they fashion pithily refined version umpteen, wasting thought, wasting energy, not subverting illegitimacy itself, in too many instances expecting applause for it all, they look up surprised that detention wire and prison bars do not clap. And I also want to open with this note. I penned this week. I've been thinking about it for quite some time now. I called it Moment for Leaving, but it could as easily be called Moment for a Fight. Every Jew in America with any reading and sense has asked inwardly what might be a signal moment for leaving or for making resistance more than political. Every American Jew, particularly those not raised in homes with refugee elders, each of us has tried to fathom what they saw precisely, what they heard precisely, what toxic broth whiffed, and what they did not see, what they did not hear, those who left Western Europe 80 and more years back, and what compelled those who chose to stay and become part of an underground. This past week, Jewish community centers, according to Matt Ferner in HuffPo, in St. Paul, Minnesota, Buffalo, Amherst, New York, Birmingham, Alabama, Houston, Cleveland, Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, Nashville, Albuquerque, Tampa, and Chicago all received bomb threats. The FBI says it does not know of any overall coordination, and yet this brings to at least 70 and more the number of such incidents in 2017 across 56 Jewish centers, continuing a post-election surge says the Southern Poverty Law Center. It is an unprecedented rate in religiously based hate threats and incidents in which those committed against Jews have always here been at the top. Since the vote, threats such as these have shut Jewish community centers in 27 states, one Canadian province. What we hear, what we do not hear. The president, at his last news conference, responded to a self-identified Jewish reporter's concern about the rise in these incidents with a series of unrelated remarks about his electoral prowess and the inappropriate nature of the reporter's question. And then several days later, he made the most flat-footed non-condemnation of anti-Semitism I have ever heard from a leader. It was pathetic to listen to it. I would like to think that my brother, my sister, and I and our adult children would see aright, would hear with wisdom, will act when necessary and with strength. What did our ancestors see? What did they hear? When did they know? When did they know either to get out or to join an underground? As for now, I am staying and I am writing. I want to open this week with a real change of pace. It's needed, and I love this guy. You love this guy, writer and artist and art professor Gary Justice. So I want to open this week with a memoir piece from Illinois State University art professor and writer Gary Justice. The first piece of his we ever aired here well over 2.5 years back. And this is going to be one of those passionate justice moments where I ask you to close eyes, lean back, and listen to a piece somewhat longer than most. Gary is not only a writer and an art professor, he's a sculptor. He does light sculpture. If you see his Facebook page, you'll see plenty of it, and each piece is mesmerizing. He worked for over 20 years in Chicago, and as you listen to this extraordinary piece, those of you who know Chicago will feel that city here in this piece. If no, you may, in a way, sense your own city, your own town. So I'd like you to lean back, close eyes, and take in Gary Justice's The Bridge. The Chicago River is an artery of great renown in the history of the city, and it connects the lower waterways that lead to the town of Lockport and beyond. Near the old neighborhood where I used to live, the river divides the district from Chinatown down through the northern European neighborhood of Pilsen and into the south loop of the Chicago center. I had heard a story about horses that walked in a circle down by the Chicago River in the days before the long winters of severe cold machine labor. People in the oldest part of Chicago told me about these horses who had lived and worked on the river in the early part of the 20th century. They were powerfully bred, trained, and shoed for sustained exertion to walk in a circle for hours down by the water. I didn't know why there would have been horses by the river years ago, and I'd no idea about the nature of their work. Some details of their tasks were told me by an old Polish woman whom I had met on 18th Street one afternoon in 1977. These draft horses were strong, and they made a house fly. It came up above so many trees, and the children laughed. They still laugh, even after the horses were gone. She was smiling to herself. I thought she just might be a little seedy, but I wanted to hear more. Before I could get additional information, the bus came. She boarded, and she waved to me through the dirty back window as it drove away. With numerous street people wanting attention in those days, I spent little time trying to make any sense of things those folks talked about. So many of them were obviously living in several realities, pulling along invisible lines of souls with whom they shared the screams and fears of their many predicaments. It wasn't until later I discovered some of the crazy folks, like the old woman, were articulate to a point where the designation of street poet could apply, protecting their savvy, practical nature in day-to-day survival. I was nonetheless attached to the idea of a house that could fly. With the small neighborhoods of Chicago, there are always scores of tiny businesses that flourish, especially the grocery markets. These shops keep everyone well satisfied in the trading of gossip goods and general news. Bertha's Grocery was one such place, an old storefront where my many Latin neighbors gathered to talk about anything from cars, weddings, and feats of bravery to visits from saints and other apparitions. Many neighbors were first-generation Mexicans, newly married, excited in a way that made the greatness of their city, our city, discernible in the quiet glory of their accomplishments. I quickly understood that having children was the greatest of these successes. Most of the children in the neighborhood were bright and friendly. The dour kids were more discriminating, not quick to be trusting, but when they came to understand I had an agenda that was somewhat ambiguous with a natural curiosity, they became articulate spokespersons. The little leaders directed much of the child's play. They always played in a mixed group of boys and girls, unaffected by most environmental issues like weather, mean teenagers, and gangbangers, stray dogs, traffic, and demanding grown-ups. Easy amblings from my studio could get me to most destinations in the city. I loved to walk, especially in the mornings as shopkeepers swept the soiled concrete in front of their businesses. Working people would catch up easily, cradling their morning coffee, nodding at each other with a smile. This was a supremely grand time of day, each person rediscovering a manner to engirdle the challenges of a new day. I locked all this activity into my brain, hoping it might set a tone for me as well. When I crossed a vacant lot that sat adjacent to my studio one morning, I saw a group of neighborhood children standing in a small clearing, surrounded on several sides by tall trees and shorter prairie shrubs. In this neighborhood, the children were fortunate to have lots to play in, away from traffic, with at least some vestige of nature in the many rabbits, squirrels, and birds that braved the inner city. The children were very excited, shouting, jumping, carrying on in a way I'd not yet seen. Some were dressed in uniforms for school, so I knew they traveled as a group, and it was not some random kid disturbance. They saw me enter the lot. This seemed to increase the excitement. A few of them pointed and shrieked in delighted bursts, trying to direct my attention to the tops of the trees. I looked up, and the astonishment from the thing I saw turned the children's commotion to screams and hysterical laughter. Above the tops of the trees I saw a house, at some distance on, away from the treetops, suddenly rise up. It slowly stopped its ascent, hovered with its bottom area partially obscured by leaves and branches, then slowly slipped down from view. Okay, why? I searched my mind for an explanation, and a foggy memory started to form. In that instant, the children, all wildly laughing and jumping, ran around the trees across the lot to Canal Street. I followed, trying hard not to affect the appearance of a chase. At the street's edge they stopped. I caught up as one of them pointed towards the river. There before us sat a giant, magnificent masterpiece of engineering, a rare vertical lift bridge. This was a monster from another age. The Chicago River was crossed by this behemoth. It had two massive steel and limestone towers supporting long horizontal span which held a small house in its center. The bridge had been making this house fly for over 3 generations. My dear God, I marveled at the thought of this industrial wonder and its power to still conjure a miraculous events in the minds of children and the wayward street poets who wandered this quarter. Later that year, I discovered I could walk down to the Bridges domain, the Amtrak yards, with no harassment from security people. Sometimes I would cross the great bridge on foot over the Chicago River, taking up the path on the southern end. I always had Alexandra, Alex, my dog, with me. Once we were across, we would turn back north, walking through largely unused prairie, all the way from 18th Street south to the downtown. This was a peaceful, unspoiled area. I later heard about the local boys in the 1960s hunting pheasant in those lower reaches below the bridges. It was difficult to imagine shotguns in the hands of youth in the city securing game while the cops ignored their small adventures. After some months, I finally discovered the bridge control house. It held the electrical switches for the great bridge. Charles, the bridge operator, had an old stray dog which lived in the control house most of the time. Alex and the strange dog showed a mutual indifference toward each other. "What's the dog's name, Charles?" We always searched for things to talk about. "Horse. And I know you're going to ask me why." Charles turned to his radio and said something in strange railroad code, then looked at me, waiting for my curiosity to rise. Okay, I genuinely was curious. "Well, when this bridge was built, there was a turnstile with 2 giant draft horses. They pulled the works around to raise the bridge when a barge was going under. They were called Horse 1 and Horse 2. Oh, that's what she meant. The street lady's image came suddenly to mind, but I wanted to avoid a conversation about her, so I stayed with the dog conversation. And the dog is right, Horse 3, but we shortened it to Horse. Who is this she? Charles looked as if he recognized something in my fuzzy recollection. I felt obliged to tell him. She was this Polish street lady who told me about the bridge. What did she tell you? Charles seemed to have some information. He waited for the context of my explanation to take form. She told me about the horses making a house fly. Oh, shit, yeah. That's Elizabeth, and she is no street person. She's the mother of a big-time landlord in this area. You live around here? You probably rent from them. Yeah, on 18th and Jefferson in an old creamery. I was a tiny bit reluctant to give the address. Oh, man, she lives above you in an old apartment. She sees things. It was a strange coincidence about the old woman. After I thought about it for some time, I came to believe part of the coincidence could be explained if we think of Chicago as a collection of small communities that border a finite body of fresh water. For the most part, it is a lake community where people can come to know thousands of folks in the space of a lifetime. I could probably walk anywhere in the area, finding tons of people who were familiar with or had dealings with Elizabeth. I knew at that moment the storyteller and the supreme sage of the neighborhood's generations of children lived above me. I wondered if she would talk with me again. I imagined her hovering like the flying house of her half-made delusion. During the first snowfall of that year, I decided to take my usual bridge route to the downtown area. The profusion of flakes falling through the air had a scumbling visual effect on the surfaces of things. The world was made soft, and with the downy presence of the snow, there were no longer any sharp industrial sounds claiming dominion over the silvery atmosphere. I had Alex with me, and we entered the horizontal span of the bridge, crossing the river heading south. When we reached the midway point, I noticed Alex had stopped. She was gazing down at the water below us. I looked down. The water was getting farther away. I looked across the Amtrak yards to the east, and the buildings were changing in their subtle visual perspectives. Without a sound, shudder, or any apparent mechanical movement, we were ascending. The action was smooth, with no creaking, no movement that I could detect, only the water moving continually away as a massive, silent barge slipped under us. We rose what seemed to be 100 feet straight up. The bridge control house looked so small. I saw Charles and Horse 3 leave the small structure and set off up the chalky access road. I wondered if they knew we were high above them. After a few minutes, as I watched the barge disappear into the whiteness further upriver, the bridge began to let us gently down. We moved again, descending to meet the serious swell of the river through the quiet, soft shades of white. I thought of giant horses letting loose the best countenance of their weightless canter, lifting their great backs, then floating us gently down. With our fear and uncertainty gone, we made it back to ground level and continued on our way, kicking through the cold powder, our gray shadows seeming to hover over white prairie floor. Every one of you, I know, join me in thanking again Gary Justice for this extraordinary piece. Perhaps it's magic realism. You'll tell me. And you may see Gary's sculpture again at Gary Justice's Facebook page, GaryJustis, or at garyjustice.org. Now we continue with Harper's Magazine's Resistors Guide. We have shared guides 1 through 6 with you, and now 7 and 8. This piece by Nimi Gorinath and Valeria Luiselli is called Terrorist and Alien. On 9 November, you and I felt a kind of paralysis. We needed a pause to protect our raw nerves, and yet it had already begun. It started with hateful stares. A relative who voted for Trump told me, "Just don't wear a scarf for your own safety." I almost said the scarf was on my neck, not my head, but I stopped myself. I wasn't ready to enter into the realm of the absurd, but This is the new reality, and we are all suddenly exposed. Alien. I feel I should have foreseen all this. I am a novelist. My mind is trained to be paranoid, to read the world like a plot in which seemingly trivial events foreshadow the climax, and there were so many signs. Signs. Maybe you remember what happened to me on the day that Trump launched his campaign. One of my neighbors approaches me as I'm locking my bike to a pole on the corner, asks me what I make of Trump's accusation that Mexican immigrants are criminals and rapists. I say the man is an ignorant clown who understands nothing of the lives of Mexican immigrants. The guy says, maybe Trump has a point. A point? And he says something about not all Mexicans being like you guys. So I ask, like us guys? Not sure I've heard him correctly. The rest of the conversation's hazy. His argument spins between classist and racist, skilled versus unskilled labor, inherent worldviews, and the unwillingness to assimilate. There is always a point at which aspirants to the American dream meet the concrete wall of racial and cultural bias. Terrorist. This story made everyone feel less lonely when you told it over a dinner a few months ago. We were drinking wine. The conversation moved easily into sarcasm and satire. We believed our foundational assumptions were on firm ground. We discussed common perceptions of immigrant writers, demobilized female fighters, the difference between rights and liberties, all while our children moved quietly through a forest of adult legs, barely seen or heard, yet overhearing us. Now it feels like we're sitting next to our children under the table, looking up. Alien. May I remind you that your 6-year-old son later told me that my novel, The Story of My Teeth, seemed like the silliest book in the world. He suggested I write more about important things like political violence. Oh, he has it pretty clear. Terrorist. The course I teach looks at violence through the lens of gender. Women's individual experiences with violence are different, but common to all is the fact that the state and society are ultimately responsible. What does a black woman facing police brutality in the Bronx have in common with a Tamil refugee woman living under military occupation in Sri Lanka? The lines we draw extend beyond identity. Alien. Well, this reminds me of a nightmare I had. I assign a group of creative writing students to read something great, say Kafka or Sacha Onagan. When they come to class and I ask them what they think, the only answer is not relatable. End of nightmare. I hear that word, relatability, for the first time a few years ago. It took me a while to understand that it was the direct opposite of empathy. A piece of writing is not relatable when it doesn't talk about me or reflect my experience. The point of literature is precisely to force us out of ourselves, to expand our understanding of the world by allowing us to see it through the mind of another person. I'm done with relatability. Now when I teach any course on literature or creative writing, I go out of my way to choose texts and topics that are totally unrelatable so as to teach my students how to make the effort that empathy, emotional and intellectual empathy, requires. Terrorist. You see, the problem is that each group has learned to protect the small political space carved out for it by identity politics. On the afternoon after the Paris attacks in 2015, a student of mine from Egypt declared that those who posted the French flag on Facebook were anti-Islam. In a tearful, confused defense, her French classmate was at once grieving and apologizing for an Islamophobia she did not feel. I often ask my students why they're interested in taking my courses. The answer always comes easily: because I am trans, queer, Native American, Mexican, black. The who is easily substituted for the why. This is identity politics. This is identity education, people. I am telling you this, and it is not good. Alien continues. And that who is often an imposed category, that who, that who is often an imposed category. I learned that. I was a woman of color when I arrived in the States, as if the new identity were part of my welcome kit. Terrorist. You are a Mexican woman, and I am Tamil, Sri Lankan, American woman. What we have in common isn't so much our identity as women of color as our rage at structures of discrimination. Rage at structures of discrimination. This is what we should be trying to do in class and in writing. Dismantling those structures so we can actually see each other. Alien. If only because speaking from inside a box is rarely an effective way to have your point heard anywhere outside it. Your son was told by someone in his first grade class that his skin was the color of poo. Terrorist. And he worries about the extermination of your daughter, his best friend, because she's from Mexico. Alien. And she wonders if our other friends who are lesbian or her Argentine African American friend will have to relocate to another country. Terrorist. And my son doesn't always like the idea of resisting. Can't Trump just send the military and police to get us, Mom? Alien. And my daughter suggests as a solution that we not speak Spanish in the street so no one knows we're actually Mexicanos. Terrorist. We're back to dealing with very basic random acts of racism. It will surely affect us internally. Can we draw on people's individual identity-based experiences with violence to create a collective political movement? Alien. Oh, I've no idea. How does one remain politically active in a world that strives to deny our presence within the political sphere, that wants to make people like us invisible by relegating us to identity categories? Immigrants, women of color, brown, black, Mexican, Asian, Muslim, all whatever minority, others, Raus. I say this without an ounce of self-pity. I don't even say it with rage. I say it with just a little regret, and I wonder, when we're separated like this, how do we remember that we still have collective responsibilities? Maybe we should just spend the next decades calmly reading Hannah Arendt on a sofa. Or invent new gods, make candles and pray to them, or stop writing novels and articles, stop teaching, and instead focus on perfecting our handwriting for posters we'll hold up in street protests for the rest of our lives. Or we swallow the merda and carry on. My students often paraphrase something you said to them one day: gotta turn all our emotional shit into political capital, yo. And Harper's Magazine, its Resistor's Guide, Part 8 of 11, Lessons from the Last Fight. The writer is Sarah Schulman. Sarah Schulman says, I was 22 when Ronald Reagan was elected. Gay cancer was recognized 7 months later. For the first half of his presidency, Reagan never said the word AIDS in accordance with his administration's dehumanization of queer people, poor people, and people of color. Over 8 years of governmental indifference and neglect, years marked also by the greed of the pharmaceutical industry. The crisis escalated. Today there are nearly 37 million infected people on the planet. In the United States, 75,000 people have died. I am still here, but many of my friends are not. The mass death of the young forever transformed my generation. I know all too well what lies ahead for us under a Trump regime is more suffering, yet I am strangely calm. I was trained in the political movements ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and the Lesbian Avengers, organizations that taught me the key to maintaining one's sanity is action. The key to maintaining one's sanity is action. The key to maintaining one's sanity is action. The strategies of ACT UP, one of the most successful social movements in recent American history, are especially helpful to examine as we prepare for what may come. Against all odds, a despised population abandoned by families and government, facing a terminal disease for which there was no treatment, joined together and forced this country to change against its will. Activists won laws against discrimination, instigated policy changes that increased social services, and influenced research for treatments. Their efforts drastically changed the lives of people who have HIV. One of ACT UP's most important principles was simultaneity of action. ACT UP never worked by consensus, never demanded the full agreement of all its members for any individual action to go forward. If you wanted to get arrested doing needle exchange as a way of bringing attention to the necessity of clean needle programs, you could do it. If someone else wanted to interrupt Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in order to protest the church's campaign to stop the distribution of condoms out of public schools, she could do that. As long as the gestures were concrete, members didn't try to stop one another from addressing the crisis however they felt was right. The Lesbian Avengers were equally focused on doing, on acting. The group aimed to empower a constituency who had spent their lives being grossly disrespected and excluded by social institutions, often including their own families. We need guidelines. We needed guidelines that would help people emerge from a position in which the only power they had was the power to refuse, and into a position of vision and agency. For example, one rule was, if you have an idea, you have to carry it out. No one could passively sit back and say, well, someone should. Second was the principle, if you disagree with something, propose a better solution. We understood that criticism alone was not helpful. These organizational frameworks supported us in taking responsibility for ourselves and solving problems. Nothing increases panic in the middle of an emergency like theoretical discussion without application. It is paralyzing and it is polarizing. When you act directly, the Avengers liked to say, the theory emerges. The stakes were high for both ACT UP and the Lesbian Avengers. We badly needed change and we needed it fast. So we operated with the understanding that if a tactic had not worked in the past, we should not try it again. This precept may sound logical, but it is difficult to obey. There is a tendency to gravitate toward the known when its problems are apparent. Our creative approaches acted as correctives to more common but less effective strategies. Passive demonstrations, for instance, in which people stand out in the cold listening to speakers say, are rarely very powerful. Far more potent are pointed symbolic actions, organized and performed by people trained in nonviolent civil disobedience and accompanied for safety by legal observers and trained marshals. Consider the genius and bravery of the black students who took seats at segregated lunch counters. In breaking the color bar, they created, for a moment, an image of the world they wanted to live in. Despite this country's endless celebrations of the heroic individual, progressive change happens most exclusively as a result of coalition. These alliances depend on the flexibility of their members, a shared commitment to concrete action, and an ethic of mutual recognition. Our desperation for a solution must not delude us. into thinking. Any single strategy is appropriate for every circumstance. It's in listening to others that we find out what works. You know, there are 10 states that have legislation pending that would criminalize peaceful protest, which means, of course, that the state legislatures or the governors could decide at any given moment when to use such legislation. Take a quick 10 seconds to think about whether or not your state is one of those states. The 10 states that have legislation pending that would criminalize peaceful protest are, west to east, Washington State, Colorado, North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Michigan, Indiana, Virginia, and North Carolina. And did you know that in North Dakota, it could soon become legal to deliberately hit a protester with your car? This is from the LA Times, a writer, Nina Agarwal. For months, opponents of the proposed $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline waged protests. They established a prayer camp and strung banners between trees. At times, they blocked roads and construction sites. They faced attack dogs, pepper spray, tear gas, rubber bullets, water sprays that turned to ice on their skin. We wouldn't have been able to delay construction to this point if it wasn't for us taking to the streets, said Dallas Goldtooth, an activist with the Indigenous Environmental Network who helped coordinate the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's months-long protest in North Dakota. But a bill introduced last month in the Dakota legislature could make the obstacles to protest even more formidable. The bill, still in committee, would make it legal for drivers to run over protesters who are standing in a roadway, clearing drivers of any liability as long as their action was said to be unintentional. No, I really do not have to tell you people where that leads, do I? The bill is just one of a raft of new pieces of legislation that have been introduced around this country in the past 8 weeks to discourage or criminalize protest, even as large demonstrations over environmental issues, police shootings, and the policies of the current president have Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Virginia, and Washington all, as I've just told you, considering legislation that would variously impose stiff civil and criminal penalties for simple, peaceful protest. Not even blocking streets. We are at a moment of historical protest activity. The idea that legislators' response would be penalizing speech rather than engaging in it, well, that's troubling. People, when it comes to a time when state legislatures agree that you can be given liability protection for ramming your car into and running over protesters in our country, will that be one of the whiffs of foul air that you need to breathe in to realize that you've got to either join an underground or get out? This next piece is from our salon writer, our friend Dr. Rodney Rowe of Clayton, Georgia. He calls this unspeakable things. Rodney says this: we didn't start in a very good place in America, and I'm not talking about the fact that we lived in drafty houses, heated with wood or coal, bathed infrequently, and had to use a lot of cologne to cover that up. The rest of the world, civilized and uncivilized, lived like that, even royalty. I'm not talking about the fact that we were plagued by epidemics of infectious diseases, or that the life expectancy was about 40 due to these diseases and resulting from high infant mortality. Europe lived and died with the same problems. What I'm talking about were the social institutions of that day. People owned and claimed that to own people was God's will. Girls were chattel to be traded in the sacred institution of marriage to improve family fortune. Again, these institutions were not peculiar to what would become the United States, but some, like slavery, persisted long after the rest of the civilized world had decided they were wrong. We went through a cataclysmic civil war that was decided in favor of abolishing slavery. Everything should have been better, but it was not. Slavery was replaced after Reconstruction with segregation and Jim Crow. Women and children were still possessions. The 19th century, marked by numerous bank panics, recessions, and depressions, came to end in what has been called a Gilded Age. It was an era of tycoons creating monopolies, controlling supply. It was also the era of the collapse of the Reading Railroad, the bank panic of 1893, and the first call for some regulation of commerce. The first decades of the 20th century saw the enactment of child labor laws, the establishment of a standard workday and work week for women. Following the onset of the Great Depression, a bank panic in 1933 gave President Franklin Roosevelt the political capital to get the Glass-Steagall Act passed, regulating the banks. The depth of the Depression also allowed for the establishment of Social Security to help the elderly without savings stay alive by borrowing from the next generation. We fought 2 world wars. Mistakes in Reconstruction in the wake of the First World War resulted in large part in the Great Depression, and that depression, as bad as it was in North America, was much worse in Germany. The Second War was truly a world war. Following that war, America went through a period of great prosperity. As a schoolchild, I and others were taught that America had evolved. We had evolved to become the greatest nation on earth. We had abolished slavery. Women had been given the right to vote, as though you can give a right. We had the GI Bill, which made higher education inexpensive and the purchase of a home affordable for vets. Everyone enjoyed these privileges, and I went to a state college for about $375 a year. Tuition, room and board, textbooks, fees, everything. This came at a time when the median family income was about $6,200 a year. That was 1963, and had more than doubled from the 1947 median income of $3,000 a year. In 1960, when I started college, the best state colleges cost only about 6% of the annual income of a family of 4. My parents owned their own home. It was a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom that had no heat or air conditioning. We had a gas space heater in the dining room, but the bedrooms were always the same temperature as outside. It just didn't rain or snow on us. The wood frame house sat on an acre of land and cost $9,000 with a mortgage. It was the only money my father ever borrowed. The point is, though, that being a veteran, he had the opportunity. My college education then cost about 5% of my father's income, and there was enough economic opportunity that I made most of that money in the summers. The family income gave us what we needed. The family home was about 1.5 times an annual income. You see, the story we were told about the evolution of the American society, you know it was a myth. I knew it was a myth. Women had gone to work during the war, had gotten used to having an income, but they were not paid equally to men. They are not paid equally to men. The entire black community was disenfranchised and under or unemployed through a number of societal and legal restrictions. Civil rights legislation became what it was over the objections of a large part of the white majority, which resulting riots, marches, murders, and other attempts to maintain the old world here. The assassination of President Kennedy infuriated many of us, not so much because we loved him, but because we loved the myth that America had evolved. Sure, we had assassinations in the past, but we've gotten past it. Presidents were killed in third world countries now, not in America. The same president who got the civil rights laws enacted also got universal health care for the elderly in a form of government called Medicare. A rough-talking, crusty, deal-making Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson, squandered all of his political capital to get the right things done. So we were well on our way to becoming the nation we could be proud of. There was the small problem, though, of a war fought not to keep us safe from a foreign enemy, but to keep it safe from an ideology. Socialism. We fought in Vietnam. I fought in Vietnam to keep the dominoes from falling. It was a futile effort. The dominoes fell anyway, and we lost almost 60,000 young Americans who were disproportionately poor, uneducated minorities. What did America have to fear from socialism? The wealthy might not have investment opportunities abroad. Returning to the 19th century, it is important to note another institution in evolution. Slaveholders, in order to strengthen their hold on slaves, taught them Christianity while making it illegal to teach them to read and write. They could then pick and choose which biblical scriptures they taught, favoring ones like slaves must be in subjugation to your masters. This approach is must. It's like the one the Roman Catholic Church used in teaching catechism to illiterate peasants. Martin Luther had no intention of starting an independent Christian sect. He just wanted to reform the church. Jesus apparently wanted to do the same for Judaism. Institutions do not like to be reformed. They exist to maintain status quo, and religion is no exception. Following the Civil War, all of the institutions were shaken, and religion was no exception. If Luther advocated a priesthood of all believers, rural America wanted a priesthood of all believers and an absence of doctrine. A plethora of sects of Christianity sprang up, many of them advocating little or no alliance with a central religious hierarchy. Many of them advocated a strict interpretation of the Bible, holding that the Bible was the literal word of God rather than a broad moral story to illustrate the way we should live our lives. Strict adherence to wording gives rise to legalism, and various sects picked their own passages to highlight, ignore, explain away. These denominations were particularly popular among poorer whites in the South who were threatened by a new group of free laborers who were competition. The teachings attributed to Jesus were given less emphasis than the teachings of Paul, and there were more emphases on the Ten Commandments, which were a series of negative statements, as opposed to the teachings of Jesus, which were in large part positive ones. The main lesson in Jesus' teaching was simply a positive way of saying what Rabbi Hillel taught in ancient Israel. The rabbi said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to another." That's the whole law. The rest is commentary. Jesus said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Some variation of that teaching is everywhere in the major religions of the world. The problem is that it is hard to work it to your advantage. by having no hierarchy and no dogma or creed. Individual pastors and church leaders could make up their own versions of gospel, and that is what happened in America with evangelical Christianity, while liberal America shook their heads over the Hutus and Tutsis killing each other, imagining that we had evolved past that. While we congratulated ourselves on succeeding in controlling banks, resulting in fewer, if no, bank panics, depressions, or severe recessions, and while we were congratulating ourselves on gaining civil rights for all and awaiting the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, the opposition was working to undo everything. The evangelical Christians have been striving to influence presidents since the Eisenhower era. Himself by the far right, by the way, people, determined to be a communist. Just have our friend Claire Connor, whose work we shared this past week, share more of that with you. And we've only become stronger in their desires to establish a religious controlling government. From the Reagan era on, they've been integral in conservative politics. Banks and the business community have rankled at their inability to do business in a way they choose, regardless of the effect it might have on the average citizen or on the environment. Somehow, the liberal left has not seen these moves as a threat to democracy or even an existential threat until now. Now, with the GOP winning the equivalent of a trifecta, they are in a position to reverse every gain American citizens made during the past 100 years. I have told you, people, I have told you that what this far right wants to do is to drag you back to an America prior to the New Deal, prior to Roosevelt. I was not mistaken. Rodney Rowe continues, we have viewed the rights as simply an alternative way of governing the country for the benefit of all. It is not. It is a means of working to the detriment of the country against millions of Americans. The right is the manifestation of an evil we have been unwilling to name or confront. Unwillingly and unwittingly, perhaps. The writer Sue Monk Kidd, in The Invention of Wings, said, there's a frightful muteness that dwells at the center of all unspeakable things, and I had found my way into it. We perhaps now have found our way into that place. Thank you, Rodney Rowe. Friend, our salon writer, Vietnam vet. I want to end today where I began, by saying first that I become concerned, deeply concerned, with you progressives when you analyze fascists' moves to a point of harm where what matters are the takes on your takes on each separate, deliberately steamrolled insult to democracy, so that by the time you fashion pithily refined version umpteen, wasting thought, wasting energy, not subverting illegitimacy itself, in too many instances expecting applause for it all, you look up, surprised that detention wire and prison bars do not clap. And as I say, for now, I'm staying and I'm writing. We only have our lives to make a difference. Phil Oakes did say it, and he was right. And you know what he said, we can only do it while we're here. I want you to join me next week on Passionate Justice, because I am staying and I am writing and I am broadcasting. You in your lives, you do what you can. Acting is more energizing than waiting. It's even more energizing than merely thinking and merely feeling. I will see you next week on Passionate Justice.